Okay. Abraham starts us into what gets referred to as the age of the patriarchs. And patriarch just means father ruler. And what we see with the patriarchal time period, remember how I was saying that so much hinged on the family unit in the ancient Near East? What we see in the patriarchal time period is this strong emphasis on kinship. It's not kingship, kinship, right? Like your kin, right? The people that you are related to. Think for a little bit when we drew out our timeline, right? We saw how civilization developed. Why would kinship be important this early on rather than kingship? Why weren't there any kings? What do you need to have a king? Right? What's included in the kingdom? Subject. What else?
Government.
If you have a kingdom, is that typically going to be over a somewhat stable area?
Yeah, land.
So land, right? If I now have this land, but also what you guys said needs to be in that land are subjects, right? So if I'm a king here, right? Here's my little king. It's way too big of a crown. Here's my little king. If all of my subjects are just moving around,
There's no order.
there's not going to be a lot of order. There's not going to be any cities, any civilizations, any kind of consistent places, no established cities. So we have this emphasis on kinship because this is around that time period when people are still fairly nomadic. Right? If people are moving around a lot, you're not going to really have a lot of kings. And that's why we have this strong emphasis on kinship during this patriarchal period, is because people are still moving around a lot. There are no real established cities as much. Right? That's still a little bit in flux. Things are kind of transitioning over into having these cities. So that's why we're going to have this idea of kinship, and this idea is going to pervade a lot of society and even religion. For example, what we'll see is this idea of Abraham's covenant with God taking this form. Right? You have Abraham representing all of his descendants in his family. The relationship with Israel's God is such that it is bound to Abraham and Abraham's family. Right? We'll see with the covenant he makes today, that when God says, I'm making a covenant with you and with all of your descendants, right? I'm promising you descendants. Anybody who kind of falls outside of that family line is, in a sense, outside of that religious group. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Anybody who falls outside of that family line falls outside of that religious group. So even the identity of Israel during this time, and who is Israelite / you could say a follower of Yahweh, is defined by these family ties. Now, what we need to make sure we do as well, and what gets really interesting is when we start looking at these patriarchs, right, when we start looking at Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is that Israel is kind of narrating their history through these three people. But in a sense, each of these people is representing one aspect or a couple aspects of how Israel understands itself. Right? Think of the patriarchs this way. Think of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob this way. Through their story, Israel is kind of painting its own little self-portrait. Each of the patriarchs is a particular brush. Okay? Each of the patriarchs is a particular way that Israel is understanding its own identity. Right? You can also think of the patriarchs as seeds, right? Kind of encapsulating who Israel understands itself to be. Right? And it's from the story of the patriarchs that we get the people of Israel. Right? So each of these three individuals is going to help us understand who Israel understands itself to be. Right? Remember, they're not just narrating history with these stories. They're not just saying Abraham then was around and then some stuff happened, and then you had Isaac and then some more stuff happened, and then there was Jacob and some more stuff happened. They're not just giving you this unbiased perspective of history. They're trying to tell you meaning. They're trying to understand themselves by telling these stories. What's the first thing that really happens here in Abram's story? And notice we are talking about Abram at this point. He is not yet Abraham. What happens first here?
God tells him to go.
Good. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. Right? Not even telling him where it is, just saying go. Right? And then after we have this little bit, so Abram went. Right? Abram, in speaking about this self-portrait here, Abram is the example or exemplar, the epitome of faithfulness. And we'll see that played out in multiple ways. God tells Abraham to do something, and the dude does it. Okay, it happens time and time again in some ways. There's some places where Abraham kind of falters. But from the outside of Abraham's story, his character is kind of defined. God says go, doesn't even tell him where, kind of offers him some good things if he does this, and then we just have Abraham going, or Abram going. So we have three promises here, right? We have the promise of, right, you can say a great nation and a great name and offspring. This is all kind of tying into the promise of, you can say progeny, you can say descendants, you can say children. We'll say progeny because it's a nice fun word and it's a word you will now learn and remember. Right? Progeny, descendants, children. This is what he's promising. To have your name great, to be a great nation, is to have many offspring. Right? So this is the first promise. The second promise is that he will bless him. Right? I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I shall curse, and in you, or through you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Okay, there's going to be some prophets that really come back to this and kind of accuse Israel of forgetting that part. Right? So that you will be a blessing. Right? Almost in a sense that with this blessing, there's also purpose in this blessing. Okay, Israel's kind of call in that part. And then finally, land. Progeny, blessing, and land are our three promises. Right? This isn't really a covenant yet. Right? And emphasis on the yet. This is not covenant yet. This is kind of just put in the form of a promise. What's something that's also interesting about the blessing, or about the promise for children? What's kind of missing from that promise? Something that we take for granted, or people who know the story take for granted, but it doesn't say explicitly.
The age.
Doesn't say how old he'll be. Good. He's 75 now.
Yeah.
He's pretty old.
He what?
So when?
Doesn't say when. Good.
Doesn't say
Where?
Who?
Good. What's that?
Who?
What do you mean who?
By who?
Aha. Does not say by whom. By whom is he going to have these children? Because if we read back to chapter 11, verse 30, which is just a couple verses before all this, we read the nice little verse that says, and Sarah had no children because Sarah was barren. And Sarah is Abram's wife. Right? We don't know by whom this promise is going to be fulfilled. And if we're reading this for the first time, we probably don't think it's going to be Sarah. Because she was barren. Right? And this is kind of the first time we have a barren woman in the text. And barrenness is often seen as being a curse. Right? Why would barrenness be seen as a curse?
Because he always told him to look.
Woo. Oh, sorry. All right, one person at a time. Anybody?
Because it was given the commandment to be fruitful and multiply.
Right? Remember, that was part of the blessing at the beginning of creation. The blessing was to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth. If you cannot do that, then there is something cosmically wrong, right? You are cursed. You are outside of that blessing, right? So we don't know at the beginning of this by whom this promise is going to be fulfilled. Good. Now we start seeing the form of the covenant. And we see it here. Right? Also, and Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Right? Talking about Abram. Right here. It's the epitome of faithfulness. Abram believed. Right? And it's reckoned to him as righteousness. And here is where we have our nice little form of a suzerainty treaty. Right? Notice this first little bit. I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess. Right? We have the identification of the suzerain. Check. We have the history. Brought you out of the land of the Chaldeans. Check. Let's see. Bring me a heifer 3 years old. And now we have this nice little event where he brings them, God commands him to bring him certain animals, and he cut them in two, laying each half over against the other. Right? He doesn't cut the birds because they're kind of tiny, and you kind of just messing the whole thing up to do that. But he cuts these two things in two. Remember we talked about covenant was cutting a covenant? Right? That's what we have here. Right? He's starting this covenant ritual. What's interesting, however, is after all this is set up and God kind of starts this whole covenant process, identifying himself, identifying his history, setting up this whole thing, is that we get Abram falling into a deep sleep. And it's not really clear whether the rest of this is a dream or a vision or something that really happens as Abram is asleep. Right? Because then we have the Lord saying to Abram, right? Is he saying it to him in his sleep? Is he saying it to him as a vision? Is he waking up to this? And know this for certain, that your offspring shall be aliens. And it goes through this whole little bit here, right? These kind of promise and conditions. And they shall come back in here in 4th generation, so on and so forth. And when the sun had gone down, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces, right? These right here. And on that day, Lord God made a covenant. Who does not go through or between the pieces? Sarah. What's that? Sarah doesn't, but Abram doesn't either, right? We have here this smoking fire pot, flaming torch kind of deal passing between the two pieces, right? And Abram is either just watching this, or envisioning it, or dreaming this, but either way, the text seems to be saying that the weight of the covenant, the one who is really taking this covenant on himself, is Yahweh. Right? In a sense, it's kind of saying, the text is kind of saying, I know you will break this covenant. So instead of making it such that for us to make this agreement, for you to walk between these two pieces, and for you to be destroyed every time you break this covenant, it is only I, Yahweh, who will bind myself this strictly to the covenant.